joining us on this wet Wednesday afternoon. My name is Joshua Bleich. I'm the Associate Director of Administration of Columbia's ERM program, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event, a behavioral and cognitive approach to enterprise risk management, a conversation with the authors, Lauria and John Burkhardt. Before we begin, I just want to share some of the program's upcoming events. Our ERM risk management seminars continue through the semester every Friday and Saturday morning. We have a networking boot camp workshop, and then we have our program director's book launch, Mr. Sim Siegel. And then finally, we have a use of artificial intelligence event in December. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Lauria. Sir.
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, loud and clear. Good work. Okay, so again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your support and your interest in what we feel is a really vital and critical topic in the world of enterprise risk management. But before we get into that, we're just going to, whoops, I was already on there, so, whoops. Okay, so a little bit about who you're going to hear from today. I'm Lauria, as Josh mentioned, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Associate Director and full-time lecturer in the ERM program. Before that, I worked for many years in the insurance industry. I'm an actuary by training. I have my fellow of the Society of Actuaries. I'm also a chartered financial analyst. And I'm really thrilled to be here, thrilled to be part of the program, and feel very privileged to be part of this great faculty that we have here at Columbia. Let me introduce the other folks. My co-author and co-presenter for today is John Burkhardt. John and I met back in 2019, back in my office at Assurant. Melissa Hall, who's out in the audience, I'm sure you remember that office over on 28 Liberty. John and I met there, and we immediately clicked, coming together to pull together this merging of risk management and cognitive science. And John and I have been working together in a number of capacities, including, of course, co-creating the Cognitive Bias and ERM course, which is the inspiration for the textbook that we're going to talk about today, as well as writing the textbook, and also now we're together working on a podcast where we've already dropped a number of episodes. And with us to moderate questions, because we're not going to talk for 2 hours, not directly in a lecture-style format, we have Mr. Bob Kostakopoulos. And Bob has extensive experience. He's very familiar with the topics that we're going to be talking about today and what's in the book. Bob was one of our book reviewers when we were going through the lengthy and painstaking process of writing this book. And John is smiling because he knows exactly what I mean. And Bob teaches a number of courses in the program. He's also Deputy Academic Director. And he's held a number of positions in the banking industry as a CEO and also as the Chief Economist for Merrill Lynch. And I'm very grateful that Bob will be moderating today's Q&A session. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is we're going to give you sort of, why do we do this book? I can tell you we didn't do it for the money. I can definitely tell you we did not do it for the money. But we are going to give you some of the background behind it, some of the inspiration and some of the inspirational folks, one of who is here in the audience, who I will point out shortly. Then we will get into some of the key themes and messages in the book, both in terms of overarching themes as well as specific behavioral themes that we really focus on in a number of areas in the book. Then, of course, the big thing that I think all of you out there are going to be interested in is how does this apply to ERM? Where do you see that in the context of ERM? And then we'll do some follow-ups where we see this field going, what we see as opportunities, not only for ourselves, but for practitioners in general. And then, of course, we would love to get questions from all of you. And we look forward to making this a conversation towards the end. So let's talk about why did we do this book? Why did John and I decide to engage in something that neither of us had ever done before? I will tell you we are first-time authors. I'm proud to say that. I'm also humbled to say that, because if you haven't done this before, I will tell you it is a humbling experience, even if you think you're a good writer. And I happen to be arrogant enough to think that I was a good writer, but I learned a lot about writing better. First off, we thought this was a great opportunity. One of the things that John and I realized from those first days before I even joined the Columbia faculty full-time was that this was an area rich with so many learnings for risk management practitioners. So many mistakes, so many failures could be attributed to just mistakes of cognitive thinking. What got in the way? What went wrong? And often what I find now is if I want to know who the enemy is when there's a risk decision that I haven't come through on, I look in the mirror first. And I start to wonder what's going on between my ears. Also, what we realized, and I give John a lot of credit, you did the research on this, there's not a lot of literature that connects risk management to behavioral science. So yes, you will read there's a lot of things out there on behavioral economics. Of course, there's some classic papers from Kahneman and Tversky and some of the other pioneers, like Thaler, that we're going to mention shortly. But there isn't any, and there's, of course, a lot of literature on ERM, but there really isn't anything out there that brought it together. So we saw this as an opportunity to fulfill a need in the space. And we believe we've done that. Now, one of the main influences, and I want to give credit to Mr. Simsiegel, who has been supportive of this project throughout. I cannot say enough about all that he's done to really move this program forward in so many directions, is the value-based approach. And one of the things that I realized even early on when I was a reviewer for Sim's book, and this was back in 2009, 2010 Sim, I realized a lot of what was in that book, and if you have the book and go back and read it, you will realize that a lot of what's in there, while he's not referring to a specific behavioral force or driver or cognitive bias, he is recommending things to do to either mitigate or leverage human behavior to make ERM more effective. And there are a number of examples I can think of. One that comes up early in the book is the definition of risk. Because his definition of risk in that book includes the possibility of upside as well as downside. Something that I remember when Sim and I first talked about it was very controversial and led to a heated conversation between the two of us. And now, in retrospect, having learned more about behavioral science, working closely with John on what goes on in the human brain, I now realize why I was so resistant and why many people are resistant to this concept. It's because it mitigates loss aversion, which is an extremely powerful force, that if all you focus on downside, you miss out on potential opportunities and citing those potential opportunities. And it's understandable because we are driven by loss aversion. It's just one example. Another one that I'll just mention, because I could actually go on all day about things that are in the book. And again, none of the terms that are in our book are in Sim's book, but he definitely realized they were there, is the concept of inertia, which we'll touch on a little bit later. He realized that people are lazy, and that if you want to get the most out of your ERM program, you have to raise energy. You have to resist the inertia. And so when he states things in his book, such as you are better off doing this through interviews than by sending out a passive survey, what he's saying is if you let inertia get in the way, you're going to get poor results back in your risk identification. again, I could go on and on about this, but we don't have all day, so. All right, I'm gonna hand it off to John to talk about some of our influences from the behavioral science side.
So one of the things that Rich mentioned in passing is that we had these ongoing freewheeling conversations all the way back in 2019. And I remember very clearly sitting in office hours during that first semester we talked together when we'd be waiting for students to show up and arrive and ask us questions. And to pass the time, of course, we would compare notes. We would talk about interesting projects we had or interesting examples or cases. And over the course of this, I think we gradually came to realize that Rich as a career actuary, I as somebody who had spent my formative years in research neuroscience, we had been studying the same things. We just were coming at it from very different directions. And so this was a very natural merger, perhaps not an obvious merger, but a natural merger of topics and approaches. And there are certain luminaries who we recognized were incredibly consequential and had laid really the groundwork and foundations for the work that we present now humbly. And we would be utterly remiss if we did not recognize and acknowledge the contributions they've made. Of course, Daniel Kahneman and the late Daniel Kahneman and his companion, Amos Tversky, for those of you who've not read Thinking Fast and Slow, they are the luminaries behind the concept of prospect theory. This is not the totality of behavioral economics, of course, but behavioral economics does not exist without Kahneman and Tversky's work. Richard Thaler, the protege of Danny Kahneman and Nobel laureate himself, who went on to describe and put forward a framework around nudge theory. He is still working today at University of Chicago is where he's at right now. And then from my space, from the area for which I come, just as known, but perhaps less so in the commercial and business and financial space, Miguel Nicolelis and Wolfram Schultz. These are neuroscientists who I personally believe one day either or both of them will probably win the Nobel Prize for their contributions. Wolfram Schultz was the first to elucidate the impact of dopamine on behavior, and we do touch on this in the book a bit on how consequential dopamine theory is and how it explains prospect theory. And Miguel Nicolelis, who admittedly there's a bit of personal bias in that he is in my academic lineage. That's a longer conversation, but really one of the first to do what he calls a Bayesian model of consciousness, wherein we use information to update our prior assumptions and then make decisions and judgments from that going forward. And this really is essential to our approach and how we characterize prospect theory and how that then feeds into expected utility theory. And I think this is a tag team. This is both of us.
Yeah, we can tag team.
Yeah.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to cover a number of themes that are in our book. Some of them are overarching themes, such as human evolution and behavior, irrationality. Others, on the other hand, are more specific behavioral ones. So maybe, John, you might want to talk to some of the behavioral ones we're going to touch on. Sure.
So, I mean, I don't want to go too deep into this, but...
Well, we're going to get into them in the other slides.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
All right, why don't we just move on? So, John, this is one of your favorites.
This is one of my favorites. I usually set this up for more of a punchline, but one of our foundational assumptions, and really I have a variation of this slide in every presentation that I deliver, is that behavior comes from the brain. And within the behavioral neuroscience community, behavior means really everything we do. Judgments, choices, decisions. These are all behaviors. Me standing here doing nothing is a behavior. So everything that we do comes from the brain. Why this is important is because our bodies have been shaped by millennia of evolution, of evolutionary pressures, of survival pressures that push us in particular directions. Well, if our brain is a part of a body, which I think is uncontroversial, and behavior comes from the brain, this means that our behaviors are shaped by these same evolutionary pressures. Why this is consequential is that evolutionary pressures care about two things: staying alive and reproducing. And we're very, very good at decisions around these types of decisions, these types of outcomes, these types of choices. But what's interesting is that these are binaries. They happen or they don't. There's not a lot of gradation around them. It's not as though you survive a little bit or you reproduce partially. And so optimization and judgments around uncertainty, we're not particularly good at that because evolution doesn't care about these things. Evolution wants us to say, let's go ahead and make sure we're okay for tomorrow. And if we're okay for tomorrow, That's good enough. And this, of course, try telling your boss, oh, you know what? The 6-month horizon is inconsequential. We're going to be okay tomorrow. Your career is not going to go very well if you take that approach. So there's been a lot of conversation in recent years around irrationality. Dan Ariely wrote, of course, Predictably Irrational, and this made the topic very in vogue. I will offer, and I think this comes through in the book, I personally have a deep dislike for the term irrational. I don't think there really is rational or irrational behavior. My own feeling is that when people describe a behavior as irrational, what they're actually saying is, the observed behavior was not in agreement with the model that I was using to make a prediction. And this, I think, is completely correct for most of ERM because ERM frameworks are largely based on neoclassical economic models. Neoclassical economic models make assumptions that people are going to act to maximize their own personal utility, that they run a probability calculation in their head and they select from the most profitable outcome available to them. We know this isn't true. Economics would say that this is not a rational approach, but behavior would say this is totally predictable. So this is why I don't really like this notion of rationality versus irrationality, because while certain behaviors are irrational, they are predictable, they are reliable and regular. And this means that we need to consider the context in which we make decisions to figure out what is the most appropriate model that we should be using for these. What are the underlying factors, such as emotion and externalities, that are going to provide as much or more input than the particular value calculations that we run. And consequently, all of our risk calculations need to be updated to factor for all of these. Definitions of behavior and risk, as I mentioned, contemporary definitions do not really align with behavioral ones. There's an economic definition of risk. I was teaching a class this last summer with a financier, and he put up his risk is uncertainty that is quantifiable. And I kind of went, ooh, no. Of course, for him, this is the formal definition of risk as exists within the finance space. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that's not the definition that we use in the behavioral neuroscience space. In the behavioral neuroscience space, that risk is anything that might happen. This is a very broad definition. And it does sort of align with Sim's definition in the value-based ERM framework in that it necessarily includes upside. There's no definition, there's no requisite rather for quantification because our brains aren't built for numericity, and so we don't make quantified calculations in our head. And so therefore, we really can't use this definition of risk if we want to make a biologically based, informed assessment of how people will tend to make their decisions. Yeah, so, sorry, we're going like a little freewheeling here. I'm trying not to get too far ahead and go into too deep lecture mode. But yes, managing and eliminating bias. First of all, let's level set and say that bias is a very loaded term in today's era. We hear about bias and it immediately takes our brain into a very particular direction. It's worth pointing out that in the behavioral and neuroscience space, bias has a very specific definition that is not associated with the negative cultural connotations that exist in conversational usage. It basically means if we deploy a mental shortcut and we arrive at an inappropriate conclusion. That is a cognitive bias. This means that bias is a natural consequence of how we think, and we can't get rid of it. It is built into how our brains operate. It is impossible to eliminate bias, but we can account for it. We can recognize that it exists, and we can mitigate it. And I think this is more in the direction where yeah.
Okay, and beyond just mitigating it, which a lot of our book focuses on, because, again, we're trying to get down to how to make objective decisions, but there is another aspect to it, which is, can you leverage bias? And what do we mean by leveraging bias? We mean constructing things in a way such that we're actually leveraging how we expect people to behave in order to achieve a certain objective. And if that's still too abstract for you, think about what retailers and advertisers do all the time. They are continually framing things in such a way to get you to buy their product. So they've already taken a lot of this science and built it into their business model. And certainly, we talk about how you can do that too in the risk space, how you can reframe certain risk information. You can take the same risk information, reframe it in a different way, and get a different decision. So if you are working for an organization that tends to make bad, let's say, M&A decisions that are too risky, perhaps it's how that information is being framed. And that if it was reframed to focus on more of the potential downsides, then you can start to work towards maybe a more objective decision. So those are some of the things that you can do in that context.
So one thing that I think is very important to put out there is much of what we present here is perhaps not part of what we've seen in most existing ERM work, and we are calling out points of attention of we need to be aware of this and be certain that you are appropriately mitigating these elements. It's important to clarify, this does not mean that existing ERM is broken. Everything we're presenting is to complement and align with existing ERM. We are not saying, let's start over from scratch and here's a fundamentally new model. This is to enhance and improve existing ERM frameworks.
Yeah, I would say, like the slide says, ERM is alive and well, and it's not a matter of whether the value base or COSO, I mean, I can make some complaints about COSO, I can make some complaints about ISO, but at the end of the day, those frameworks, if you do execute them, you will get a lot of what you expect to get from them. The issue is the behaviors that are going into the different aspects of it, whether it's identifying risk, whether it's assessing risk, and so forth. That the things that are central to our brain and how it works, such as our tendency to identify and quantify risks that are most top of mind, right? So it's like sitting in an analyst chair. What comes to mind? That is how we tend to think. We tend to draw on things that are easy because we are trying to save energy. There's a real efficiency imperative that John writes about wonderfully in the book that really underpins everything that we do. So that can get in the way of your ERM process if you don't bring awareness to it. That is the point we're trying to make. We're not saying, don't do your qualitative risk assessments. We're not saying stop building your risk models or build them in a completely different way. We're just saying please bring a certain mindfulness to it and be able to step back and see what is driving the underlying assumptions and the information that you are collecting.
And I think a lot of what we present here exists in if you're familiar with some of like military terminology, the right of boom. On the right side of where the particular decision happens. Risk ERM frameworks are executed well, do provide very good guidelines for how an organization should proceed. However, people then need to implement those decisions. And a lot of what we get at is, okay, even if you have a very good, well-founded decision, how do you then make sure that is implemented correctly throughout the organization? This is something where I don't want to say it's necessarily, and then a miracle happens, tends to be the predominant paradigm, but I think it is a space that is not attended to as much as the mechanics of the ERM frameworks themselves.
Right, and we're saying you need to go beyond just being mechanical about the whole thing and to bring a certain mindfulness, a checklist of potential behaviors that may have seeped in some way, often understandably.
All right, so here we're going into some more of those specific behavioral tendencies that Rich mentioned and teed up. One of the big ones that we talk about extensively in the book is in the domain of mental accounting. And this is, I always have to hammer this home whenever I was teaching this class, that mental accounting is not a cognitive bias. Mental accounting is what our brains do. This is the default operating mode. It's a feature, not a bug. And as a consequence of mental accounting, one of the big things that we do is allocate silos. We're very, very good at categorizing and putting labels on things, and then we think about them in those labeled contexts. And we don't like moving them together. We don't like thinking across those silos because that takes a lot of effort. And this, of course, is a very natural tendency within organizations, within risk management. Organizations, we have departments, we have divisions. It's very easy to say, okay, well, that's marketing. Marketing needs to worry about that. Sales needs to worry about that. Operations needs to worry about that. And there is this fiction that we tell ourselves that what's happening over there in sales doesn't affect me over here in IT, and vice versa. And this is a natural tendency. And it largely arises from our desire to reduce the processing load and simplify the decisions that we need to make. I don't know how much.
Yeah, I'm going to add a little bit on to that in terms of my perspective on mental accounting. It shows up everywhere, and as John knows, I believe one of the major underpinnings moving from RM to ERM that's embedded in several of the 10 key ERM criteria in Sim's book focus on moving from trying to remove elements of mental accounting or isolating items into looking at things more holistically. And it brings me back to my days, and Sim and I have known each other a long time, back to 1990, I think, when I was working in the group pensions area at MetLife. And I remember working on a project to come up with a risk charge on a group pension contract that had certain risks embedded in it. And I was really proud of the model. But I remember at the end going home and thinking, wow, there's all these other actuaries and actuarial students working on other similar kinds of projects, and who's putting it all together? Who's really looking at the whole piece? Now, that was just a thing I thought about. I went back to work the next day. I was happy working on my APL model. So I just kept working, but it was always there that there is a tendency, a very understandable tendency, to just focus on one little isolated part of whatever you do and say, okay, well, if I do this, well, then everything will work out well. And that's not necessarily true. And that there needs to be some sort of reconciliation, some recognition of what's going on at an entire entity level.
Gain, loss, and asymmetry is perhaps like the most mechanistically, the biggest mechanical problem that ERM frameworks and really any sort of predictive or financial framework faces in organizational and business space, which is mathematically gains and losses track symmetrically. They are equal functions just in opposite directions. But our brains don't process them that way. And this goes back to that survival imperative. We're not built for numericity. We're not built for currency. We're built to stay alive. And losses, any sort of loss in the environment in which we came up could result in us dying. So losses are seen much more negatively than gains of comparable magnitude. Because a loss could mean game over for the rest of time, whereas a gain just means, okay, we're good for the next couple days. Unfortunately, this is the same decision-making circuit that we're stuck with today. And so we talk about how the most colloquial way of putting this is the pain of losing $100 is greater than the pleasure of gaining $100. And I think we all have seen this in our own day-to-day life. And this really is directly responsible for much of that laser focus on downside risk and mitigation and elimination of downside risk, because downside risk hurts. Downside risk hurts much, much more than any sort of upside possibilities. Now, this can keep an organization in existence, but this also means that an organization will oftentimes be unintentionally, willfully blind to significant growth opportunities.
So I'll just add to that. We're going to touch on it in terms of an ERM example, and one that I know is dear to Bob's work and dear to his heart, I know from many conversations we've had, which is the whole idea of systemic risk. And that the idea of everybody focusing on downside, and not only focusing on downside, but interestingly, once individuals get into a loss position, they're more likely to roll the dice to try to get out of it. That they'd rather take a bigger loss, and you see this in casinos, you see this in other types of gambling situations, but we even see it in corporate boardrooms, where a company is floundering, a company is on the brink, and they just decide, you know what, we're going to double down on what we're doing. Because what have we got to lose? At some point, the regulators will just come in and take us over, which gets to an interesting dimension of regulator as a stakeholder versus corporate management. That corporate management has a different type of risk-return mindset in the loss domain than a regulator does.
And I think it's important to point out, this connects back to something Rich had said earlier about context, or maybe it was I who said, it was a slide that said something about context, which is that an individual's choice architecture can change depending on what particular decision that they're facing, depending on not just is it a loss or a gain, but where are they in terms of previous gains or losses. And so we need to be able to adjust our own expectations in predictive modeling based on knowing where somebody exists in their choice architecture. Time. This is something that I think, I wouldn't say that Rich and I look at each other and just kind of throw up our hands, but it's something that is a pernicious and omnipresent issue, I think, in all fields of risk management, enterprise or otherwise, which is that time is a big bugaboo. The further away an outcome occurs, the less we pay attention to it. And this manifests both into the future and into the past. The further in the future an outcome will land, the less consequential it is toward decision making. The further in the past something has previously occurred, the less we pay attention to it to inform our own decision making in the present. And the central challenge, I think, here is that by its very nature, nothing in risk management lands today. Everything in risk management is a future outcome. All of these are going to be discounted, and because most outcomes are going to land on inequivalent time horizons, they're all going to be discounted by different amounts. And how do we normalize that? How do we then make sure that we are doing an apples-to-apples comparison among different outcomes? We have, of course, we do address this, and we do have some tools to work towards this, but it is something that is, I think, far too often unrecognized within most risk management decision-making frameworks.
Well, and I think the financiers, the bankers, figured that out centuries ago when they created the whole concept of time value of money. So we do have a chapter dedicated to capital budgeting, which really leverages the whole banking model around charging interest for allowing folks to borrow money for a certain amount of time. So there is a mechanism in there, but that's not really what we're talking about from a behavioral sense. In the behavioral sense, there is a pervasive discounting, and sometimes even much more than what you'll see in a banker's model. So things that are going to happen tomorrow, we tend to go towards. So we love immediate gratification. In terms of, can I have that chocolate cake now? Or, should I start my diet a week from now? We're going to eat the chocolate cake now more often than not, unless you've got really good willpower, because we just love immediate consumption. And the reason that, particularly in this country, we are a debtor nation, I don't know what else to say, the statistics say so, is because we like to be able to take something today and worry about paying for it later. That is just how we are wired. And so that is how folks sometimes get into debt and get into personal bankruptcy, is through some of the phenomenon in terms of their own personal risk management.
Social networks and group processes. We have actually a chapter within the book titled Beware Smart People in Large Groups. Most of the biases that we talk about are individual biases, but there are emergent phenomena that occur when you get people together in groups. And there's a sort of tendency, because for the last 15, 20 years, organizations have largely moved towards consensus models, saying that, let's get people together, let's collect inputs from all different stakeholders and use that for our decision-making processes. This is probably net positive, but new dynamics emerge when you put people together that did not exist when you just had autocratic decision-making. There's a whole different set of cognitive biases that occur when you have social groups that you don't need to worry about when you have individuals making the decisions unilaterally. And one of the big ones, we have an entire chapter on groupthink, but that's not the only one. There are all manner of things where social pressure and social proof come into play, inertia and behavioral gravity. All of these can lead people to make decisions that they will recognize. I don't believe this, I don't think this is correct, but they will willfully say, sure, I'm going to go ahead in this direction.
Yeah, and I'll just bring up something from my experience teaching in the program. So a lot of our ERM program is built around teamwork. And the reality is, from talking to numerous groups across my classes over the last 6 years, has been that in a group, maybe if you have a group of 6, maybe 2, maybe 3 people do the work. I'm looking at someone who I know knows exactly what I'm talking about, one of my former students. And the rest, they do a little work here, a little bit there, but it's really 2, maybe if you're lucky, 3 people that drive a big project. And a lot of it is because when people get into groups, there's almost a feeling of, I can be lazy again. Oh, thank God. I can save some energy. I can go for that run tomorrow. Maybe, do a few more weights, whatever I wanted to do, run a few more errands. So-and-so will do the heavy lifting on the project. Why should I think? My God, thinking takes energy. So this is something we talk about extensively in the book, and it does affect decision-making, because what you wind up having, to allude to John's point, is a situation where maybe one person speaks up, has an idea, and everybody says, okay, there's the idea, let's go run with it. Why should we have any deliberation? But then that defeats the purpose of why you got the group in the first place.
One of the recommendations that we put forward is that if a recommending group comes forward and their recommendation is unanimous, that if you poll them afterwards and everyone is on board, throw the recommendation out. You don't want a recommendation that everybody says, yes, I'm on board with this, because that is a really good indicator that the decision-making process was contaminated. Inertial forces. Behavioral inertia is one of my favorite things to talk about. It's one of the most pernicious problems for any sort of behavioral effort. And I like to call it the low cost of doing nothing. We like to not change what we're doing. Not changing what we're doing is good because it requires 0 effort. Even if there's a path that is objectively better, that can lead to better outcomes, that can lead us to a happier life, whatever we've been doing has already gotten us to this point. You know what? It's easier to just keep doing what I'm doing. And so, especially in large organizations, when you start overlaying group dynamics onto inertia, changing the inertia of an individual or an organization is a monstrous effort. And this is almost always going to be the biggest challenge that you face within any organization.
Yeah, and I will say that a lot of what ERM is about, especially if you want to do ERM in a really effective way that gets into serious decision-making, it involves change management. At its heart, it's about changing people's minds and hearts. And people come to work, they want to get a paycheck, and they want to know how to get that paycheck, how to be successful. I remember a number of years ago, it might be 20 or 30 years old now, this book. It's a book called Who Moved My Cheese? And essentially, it's a book about how hard it is for people to change once we get entrenched in habitual patterns. And I'm just going to tell you, I turned the big 6-0 this past summer, and it gets harder as the years go by. So when you are trying to do this in a big organization, especially where it's decentralized, you have a lot of offices all around the world, and I've worked in those places, it can be especially trying. You feel like you're saying the same message again and again, trying to encourage this change, and you really have to try to leverage people's behaviors to initiate that change. Okay, I'll take it from here.
You drive.
I can drive from here. All right. So we're going to talk, we've already been talking to some extent about ERM examples, but just some places where I think these are things that are particularly profound in the book. And actually, I'd like John to speak to this, but I will say that this was eye-opening for me. Very eye-opening, the idea of where risk appetite comes from. And as I say all the time when I teach courses in ERM, you really don't have an ERM program if you don't have a well-defined risk appetite and hopefully underlying limit framework. And risk appetite really does come down to a behavioral decision. And that behavioral decision is driven by 2 components. One, our preference for risk. Most of us tend to be risk averse, particularly in the gain domain. And the other is by how we perceive risk, how we perceive a particular risk or set of risks. So now again, it's not a simple like A plus B type of thing, but these are the two driving factors. Maybe, John, you could talk about it a little bit more from that standpoint.
Sure. So risk appetite, we would say in the behavioral space, that's the phenotype. That's what you observe somebody chooses to do. That's like, this is our threshold. We do not go beyond this threshold. Preference and perception create that threshold. Preference is an intrinsic characteristic of how comfortable am I with this level of uncertainty. You could say that somebody with a high risk preference is more of a thrill seeker or more open to variability, whereas risk perception is much more around how do people understand the probabilities and the factual information around them. This is more information-based, and this is far more mutable. This is something that can be adjusted. It's not necessarily an intrinsic personality trait. It's dictated or influenced, at least, by information that's available to people and how people interpret and, to some extent, choose to interpret that information. And what's very important to keep in mind when you are evaluating a risk appetite is that different combinations of preference and perception can create the same risk appetite. Why this is important is if you are, for example, a director of risk, like if you are leading a team of risk analysts and you have something very big on the table, or if you're a CRO and you have to deliver some challenging news to the executive board, you might be in a position where you need to change or influence the risk appetite of the organization or of the stakeholders who dictate the risk appetite. You need to have an understanding of what is the aggregation of their risk appetite. Is it coming from a place of preference or from a place of perception or an equal balance of both? Because then how you change it is going to be very different for one versus the other. It seems as though it's a bit of just academic hand-waving, but it is very practically consequential if you actually have to message towards a risk appetite and influence it in one direction or another.
And if you're looking for practical examples that you can quickly draw to mind using availability bias, you can think about just the whole COVID situation. In that, you know, if this was taking place 4 years ago, I certainly would have had a mask on. I'll even guess maybe John maybe wouldn't have, but a number of you either wouldn't be here or would have had a mask on if you were here. So we're all here today, we're unmasked. What changed? Did we all of a sudden become risk seekers? Okay, I know a number of you out here in the audience, and I would say the answer is probably no. But what changed is our perception, which comes through in terms of information. And that is the leading way of trying to change risk perception, is through processing new information. And that what we tend to do is that as new data comes in, our perception of risk tends to change. And that's why, in terms of risk appetite, it's really the risk perception aspect which is more malleable. Our risk preference is something that if you want to be more of a risk taker, I would posit you probably have to do more work on that. You have to consciously get yourself into those uncomfortable places. All right, this is one of our favorite topics, and we've done at least 2 or 3 podcasts, at least in some way connected to it. It's the concept of deal lust. And I can't take credit for it, although John gives me credit for the term.
I've never heard it from anybody else, so it's yours.
It was a term that came up during my years at Assurant in the M&A space, that sometimes there would be deals where there'd be some excitement around it. And sometimes there would be such excitement that there'd be a falling in love with a particular transaction. So that is really what we mean by deal lust. I did not invent it. And certainly, from what I've observed in my research, it's been pervasive in M&A history, and I would argue is one of the key contributors, because what tends to happen, and this gets back to what John mentioned with regards to groupthink and group processes, is that there tends to be a feed-forward effect, that once somebody comes in and says, yeah, this is a great deal. We can do this, we can do that, we'll triple our revenue, we can cut our costs, we can cut all these people out, and other people start to get on board and go, yeah, we can do that. We can do that. And then what tends to happen is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is pervasive throughout the whole risk framework. It tends to pop up again and again, but particularly with regards to decisions, we tend to discount any information that might contradict or counter to where it's going. And especially because, for any of you who've worked in business long enough and have tried to grow a business, it is really, really hard to grow a business organically. So doing deals always feels like the convenient shortcut to doing so. It's very, very tempting, and therefore leads to potential groupthink and finding a narrative, finding a story, because look, you're gonna have to get the deal approved by the board at some point. So you better have a really good story, and everybody just starts to tie into it and say, wow, this works. I think this hangs together. And it's not until the light of day when everything's signed that some of the problems tend to show up. And that's because they were there all along, but they were discounted due to those lustful feelings to get this transaction done.
This also follows from something that within the behavioral space is so well recognized that it's barely spoken of, but outside the space is seen as almost heretical, which is that attitude follows behavior. This seems like it should be the other way around. It seems like it should be that we do what we believe, but actually it's quite the opposite. We believe what we do. And when you put yourself in a position where you are a part of a group that's evaluating a potential M&A transaction, let's imagine that you are uncommitted or you don't care or you're a little over your head and you aren't sure. And Bob and Doug and Janet all say, yeah, full speed ahead. You just want to get out of there. Like, sure, full speed ahead. Let's go with it. I don't really have a compelling counterexample. Okay, you're uncommitted, but by expressing that agreement over time, you actually are going to come to genuinely believe it because you are signing off on it. You are contributing to the reports. You start realizing, hey, I must believe this. And so deal lust is something that is very challenging to look back on because I think you've told me the story where you had somebody who, in the first session was very skeptical about a particular transaction, and by like session 3 or session 4, he was like gung-ho champion of it. People genuinely come to believe in their support for these things that that under normal circumstances they would be ambivalent or even negative around. And it's very difficult to mitigate against this.
And finally, one that, again, I think Bob can probably speak to best, run on the bank kinds of situations, which we've seen throughout the history of banking. And now we see it even in the crypto space, particularly with certain stable coins. We saw it recently, I guess 3 years ago with Terra Luna is probably one of the most prominent examples, where, again, there's a feed-forward effect, there's a panic, there's loss aversion, there's a whole bunch of things that everybody starts to come together and boom, something that looked valuable on day one, 2 days later, nowadays could even be 10 minutes later with the ability to transact electronically, could be worth close to nothing. And this is something that, again, with the advent of AI, with the advent of electronic trading platforms, free electronic trading platforms, is going to be more, is going to lead to more volatility and more potential beatdowns of assets.
Yeah, a lot of this is mediated by something that we talk about extensively in the book, which is how our brains deal with uncertainty, which we don't like uncertainty. We don't like not knowing what's going to happen. And so I use this term extensively. We look for pillars of certainty when we are not sure what's going to happen in the future. One of the ways we look for certainty is, what are other people doing? And so this is exactly how behavioral contagion occurs. If you are uncertain what's going on, if there's a sufficient volatility in the market or around a particular economy, what are other people doing? If I know that Bob and Bill and Alice and Jane are all doing this, I probably should be doing that as well. Maybe that they're no better informed than you are, but this then acquires its own gravity, and then if 6 people have done it, then 12 people are going to do it, and then 100 people are going to do it. And you have this feed-forward, as Rich indicated, process that leads to herding behavior. It's probably not going to be necessarily the best or correct decision, and in the context of bank runs, of course, this collapses banks and potentially collapses economies, but it's a very natural process.
Yeah, and this has led to, and we talk about this in other courses like systemic risk, and we also talk about it to some degree in external stakeholder requirements, some of the solutions that banking regulators use. It's led to the invention of deposit insurance, which again provides certainty during these periods of uncertainty when a bank's financial status is going under question. It's there to prevent the kinds of runs that can take place because it provides a safety net. And we all want that certain safety net. We all want to be like cradled and, okay, everything's going to be okay. We know your money's going to be safe. So these are things that are real, and these are the types of things that any sort of regulatory intervention has to take into account to be effective. Okay, so that's most of our formal comments. We do want to talk about some follow-ups and opportunities that we see from this. We alluded to earlier our podcast called Behavior and Risk. It's free. Okay, so that is something that I know, again, loss aversion, we are appealing to loss aversion. You don't want to pay any money for it. So it's on Spotify, and if you have trouble finding it, please reach out to either of us. We're happy to send you the link. And we've dropped, what do we have?
19, I believe.
19,
we're up to 19 episodes.
Where our goal is to get to 20, so we're really close. Because I think 95% of podcasts never make it to 20 episodes. So we have that benchmark there for us. All right, so please keep listening. And again, we would love to get feedback on what we're talking about, or if you believe there are other topics that our great research team, and I do want to give a shout out to our fantastic researchers, Jin Zhang and Sherry Ji, who are now back in China, but they were former students of mine about a year ago. They have done unbelievably terrific work in this space and have provided us a lot of great information. So a big shout out to both of them. We also have Athena Liu, who is here in the audience. She's also a former student of mine who is currently helping us with our podcast research, as well as Mario G, who is here as well and helping us out with some of our research, and Lena Young, who's recently joined us and is a top 5 graduate from our program. So
and Qingying, let's not.
And yes, and Qingying Gao, who was helping us for a number of months. So we've been very blessed to have some of the best and brightest graduates from our program who have found this to be a great space to work in and do further research. And it really builds on a lot of the concepts that are in the book and that we just touched on a little bit here today. So we hope that by listening to a couple of episodes, and our favorite one, I think, is the one on Brightline, the Dark Angel of the Rails. That's kind of like our personal favorite for a whole bunch of reasons. We would recommend, we would advise you that you can listen to us, and hopefully this will trigger some further thought. In addition, there's a number of research areas that we are considering, and I don't want to go too far afield, but we, believe it or not, are even thinking about writing a second book.
We swore we would not, and then
we'd never do it again.
Our research team came to us with the question, and we looked at each other and we realized, oh no, we forgot a chapter. Yeah. And then we mulled it over a bit, and we realized this isn't a chapter, this is another book. And we decided we would table it. And I think about 2 months ago, we had a conversation where we realized we're actually planning on writing this book, aren't we?
Yeah, it's getting there.
Yeah, so.
And then we are also working on an implementation framework, because one of the things that we have gotten feedback about is, okay, well, how do you take all these ideas and put it in an organized way that it can enhance an existing ERM program? So that is something that is currently in the work, and we've made quite a bit of progress, and we will be using it and deploying it in some way, shape, or form. And of course, we believe there's a real consulting opportunity here, and that is something that we're being very vocal about, that we think there is ample opportunity for organizations to do better ERM, better risk management in general, and we are ready and willing and will we've definitely got our spaces where we can come in together and provide really good guidance. So anything else you'd like to add?
I think you've covered it.
Oh, gee, I'm sorry. I overspoke on this one. All right, so again, those are our prepared remarks. We still have over an hour here, so we would love to hear from you, any questions you may have. And Bob is going to be the moderator of our questions.
So the good news is that there are mitigations. There are things that we can do to overcome those adverse situations, right? So I think we have some questions here. While you are thinking of questions that you may have of your own, may we start?
If nobody has a question,
Yeah, we can.
you may want to be thinking. Oh, Melissa, please.
Yes, I have a question about the time and the notion of time, because you mentioned that the farther behind us the risk is, or the farther in front of us, the less likely we are to think about it. But how do you address this sort of situation where I always put in my mind, that risk is out there, but I'm going to figure something out before I get there?
So that sounds like a combination of things. There is the discounting, and there is optimism bias. Optimism bias is sort of a precondition of getting out of bed in the morning, as we are, as humans, wired to be optimistic. And that notion of, I'm going to figure something out, is widespread. It's especially widespread around entrepreneurs and founders. I can say that as somebody who has my own small business, that very often I'll look at Q4 revenue projections and say, something's going to land for that. So yes, it is a very natural tendency. And these two tendencies of the future discounting and the optimism, they do facilitate each other. And it is something that is a challenge that for especially large enterprise planning, we need to be very aware of and make sure that it's not something where somebody is making an assumption that it's not problematic because we're going to find something. We have, I can speak a bit further, but I think.
Well, all I was going to add, Melissa, is that, again, to John's point, we need that optimism, but it has to be tempered because we also exhibit a related bias called overconfidence. And there are many, many examples, particularly in the corporate space. A lot of corporate executives tend to be overconfident in their abilities, particularly their predictive abilities. And Melissa, you probably remember from, I don't know if they still call it this today, but the go-gets in the plan. And if you're going to put a go-get in there, there's a tendency that the longer out you go, the more go-gets you put in, or the more speculative types of positive actions that are reflected in the plan. And that's not to say that you won't come up with that risk management or that risk mitigation idea. It's just that you do have to be conscious of it. And I would suggest in that context too, you might want to at least have an idea of what it is, even if you don't have everything ironed out. That would be my thought.
Yeah.
Yes?
So you kind of mentioned that the current risk model are relatively good to mitigate risk, but there are a lot of obstacles in implementing those risks. You also mentioned prospect theory. So some of the examples that I think of is for the Silicon Valley Bank. They kind of rest on the top of all the fourfold pattern in the prospect theory, where they're kind of risk averse because they're tripling their money consistently, but on the same time, the interest rate are keep rising. They probably should be in that risk-seeking zone. And how do you think, like in the implementation framework that you're working on, how do you think the risk officer could use some of the tools that you're working on to mitigate those risks in hindsight?
So I will confess I'm not terribly familiar with the example you brought forward, but I'll say I can speak more broadly. So prospect theory, I hope that we've been very clear that we don't think that this should be the tool that people use. You have two broad tools, and I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but for purposes of this conversation, you have the pure behavioral economic prospect theory. You have the pure neoclassical economic expected utility theory. One of the things that we've argued is that for institutional decision making, and especially for anything where you have recurring decisions, where you have the same shape of decision multiple times going forward in time, is that expected utility theory actually works very well. It is a very good prescriptive tool. The problem is it's not a useful predictive tool. And we need the prospect theory to make the predictive models of what people are likely to do. Because to feed expected utility theory, you need good probabilities of what people are most likely to do. So you use prospect theory in order to generate your predictions, to generate your probabilities that then go into expected utility theory. This then probabilistically means over time your expected utility calculation is probably going to be fairly correct. Now, it's not especially useful for any single decision because you don't have an aggregate then. You don't have an average. You have a binary. This outcome happens or it doesn't. But for recurring decisions, like for example the market conditions you just laid out, then yes, then any sort of recurring framework that probability times value equals EU. That's going to be a fairly useful and robust model. Just you have to make sure that you are populating it correctly with good information and not just the assumed rationality of the masses, because that assumed rationality is not going to happen.
Yeah, and that's really at the heart of the challenge of using existing neoclassical models, is that it assumes that everybody's an automaton, right? Everybody is homo economicus. Everybody is acting rationally to optimize their own values, right? Their own income. And that's simply not a true statement. It's not how it works. And so I remember back in my early actuarial days trying to price certain embedded options in annuity contracts. And the reality is people do not efficiently exercise their options because of things like inertia or other contextual reasons they may not optimize an option. So these are the types of things that you need to try to factor into your model in order to better assess the underlying risk. And certainly in the context of what happened a couple of years ago with like Silicon Valley Bank and those banks and what was going on with the management in those particular days, I don't know exactly what was happening behind those doors, but I would say that it got to a point where being able to mitigate some of the risks they were taking wasn't economically feasible, or may not have been economically feasible. Because again, as an actuary told me a long time ago, a really smart actuary said, you can't insure a burning house. Once the house is burning, you're done.
Okay.
First and foremost, congratulations on this great work. Because I can tell you, this is so much needed in the world of ERM. When people don't want to hear that human inherently are biased, irrational beings, and the future could be uncertain, right? I was just wondering, in terms of practically incorporating this in our life, as I had an ERM in our work, like a concise training about the kind of bias and bias would definitely help and go a long way. Because a lot of times when we do the surveys internally, we have to do biases. Whenever the decisions are being taken, these are always fueled by these things that you talked about. So have you thought of something like practical recommendations of how we can incorporate it in the work?
So this is a very thorny question, and this is at the core of a lot of the sort of consulting work that we've done and looked at. The challenge is because humans are involved, there isn't a one-size-fits-all decision or one-size-fits-all recommendation. And I think I believe we're both pretty much in agreement on this, that it's very difficult to go in and say, here is the two recommendations that will improve every ERM. It's appealing because it appeals to that simplification of the reduction of processing load and the simplicity and the certainty, the implied certainty of if you do X and Y, then your Z output will be phenomenal from here on out. I should probably have also caveated all of this with, I am a scientist by training, and so I really like answers that begin with, it depends. But the data dictates everything. You know, how is your organization structured? Certain biases tend to be more prominent, organizations tend to be more susceptible to them, depending on how they're structured. Is there a lot of siloing? Is there a lot of hierarchy? What are the directions of communication? Who has custody of information? All of these things dictate what biases are going to be most pernicious within an organization. And so I hate to sort of hand wave away the answer, but I couldn't make an intellectually honest answer of here are like the 3 things you should do, and then your organization will be fine.
I agree with everything John said. And I will just add that I do think there are some things that you could still do to see what kinds of biases may or may not be coming into the work you're doing. Certainly, you could look at how you're collecting data, and you can see, could this be susceptible to, say, representativeness or to availability? And I would argue that probably every ERM program tends to fall at least somewhat prey to availability because we're all on social media all the time. We're all listening to the next news feed. We're all prisoners of the moment to varying degrees. So there's always going to be a little bit of that. So I do think there are some things you can do in terms of filters that you can evaluate some of the processes you have. But I do agree with John's statement overall. I mean, John's right on point. It is contextual, and it does depend on how an organization is set up, how the risk function is set up, and how it's embedded within the organization. But thank you.
Behind you. Yes.
So it's kind of piggybacking on this question here, but when you get to the point of implementing, right, this approach, what are your thoughts on the difficulties that may come up with squaring this with traditional ERM practices and frameworks that are currently in most companies, right? How would you kind of think of the difficulties versus potential immediate wins?
Okay, so I think the difficulty, and this is true even with when an ERM program is implemented, is just the initial resistance. There is going to be, because to do this, I think it takes a certain level of humility, and what I learned in yoga teacher training, we call it Svadhyaya. It's the 7th limb of yoga, so I'm going to bring a little yoga into this because my students out there know I'm a big yoga fan. But all that is a fancy Sanskrit word for looking at yourself, self-study. And that's something that really requires introspection, humility, and in an age and in an era where it's about the next quarterly result, it's about beating the competition and all that sort of thing. Sometimes that can be hard to do and a lot to ask of an executive team to be able to do, especially if they've put so much work into building an existing ERM program.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. In terms of, I don't want to say putting on a behavioral overlay, that sounds like it's gilding or veneer, but embedding behavioral processes or behavioral awareness into an existing ERM program, there has to be an intentional appetite for it by people who have custody of it. You know, if one person on the board says we're going to do this and nobody else is bought in, it's not going to work. Then it becomes a change management process, which is an undesired change management process. In practical terms, oftentimes this means that you're going to have organizations that have suffered failures and who are going to be the most receptive to it. But oftentimes, I mean, hopefully, our hope is that there will be some social proof and this just become more of the industry standard of established best practices from here on out.
And let me be clear that we're not saying that these quote-unquote biases, and again, I really dislike the word biases. I prefer to use the word heuristic, but the cognitive bias term is so embedded now that we do use it extensively in the book. But these heuristics, they're just shortcuts. They're mental shortcuts in order to save on energy, get us the information we need quickly. So it's not necessarily bad stuff that is coming up. All this is about really is just being aware of what heuristics may be filtering into what you're doing and what blind spots you may have in your program. What are the risks you might be missing or discounting because of that? This is just about making the program better and providing better information.
You can also think in terms of talking about implementation, doing it on a pilot basis, where you go through assessing whether it be controls or whether it be a strategy department, what sort of processes they use, and make an assessment there as to where those cognitive biases come in. I mean, the good thing about the behavioral people is that they have provided ways to address them. And believe it or not, many of those things have been, accepted, have been adopted. If you have a 401k plan, for example, or go to a company that has a plan like this, probably it has an automatic enrollment, and that gives you the chance to opt out if you want to. And that's a result of Thaler's idea of how you make people who may be prone to those biases, do nothing, to still do nothing, but at least get enrolled automatically in the program so that you can benefit from your retirement. That's the mental, category, right? Where you frame, why are you doing it? I'm doing it because for my future retirement. So that's a good thing. So I'm doing the right thing. But yes, piloting things can get you started. Yes.
So I do have a question regarding to, you mentioned about the silos. And when an organization is constructed, they do have to separate the functions into the different departments. So because the perspectives are siloed, kind of constrained into their own function, then how do, in your perspective, how do you balance the management needs for separating all these tasks into different functions and the overall incentives on how to make sure each department are contributing to one vision instead of being trapped into silos?
That's a great question, and that gets into, the question had to do with the fact that organizations are built on silos, and you have different functions and different businesses, and they each have their own objectives that they're trying to achieve. And the question was, how do you incentivize people to think more about the bigger picture, about how they're contributing to the overall whole and going beyond the silos? And that is an ongoing challenge for organizations, for compensation committees of boards, and for organizations and management in general around incentivization. And I would just say that it requires a delicate balance, but you do need to incorporate some metrics that are total organization related. It can't be all that way, because then you wind up falling prey to a business unit that might not be performing, and then you suffer because of it. But there is a delicate balance between providing some measurement benchmarks that are more total organization based.
I'll offer that as a practical matter. I feel that the CRO needs to have visibility into every business unit. Yep. Risks don't emerge singly. They don't emerge from single business units. They can, but they also can emerge emergently. That's a bit of a mouthful. But the CRO needs to have visibility into what every business unit is doing, and this means that good communication channels need to exist from minimally the director of each business unit to the CRO. Now, what do those communication channels look like? How often do those need to be, how frequent do those touch points need to occur? That's going to depend on your organization, that's going to depend on the workload, but the CRO, by the nature of their obligations, needs to have very, very broad-ranging visibility throughout the organization.
Yeah, and it really comes down to leadership. You need to have strong leadership built on strong communication and trust, and an understanding of what the organization is trying to accomplish and what the risk organization is trying to do in that context. Yes?
Thank you, Rich and John, for sharing this today. I just want to get back to the notion of time. That's a very interesting topic that you kind of like discounting your future fear about the games. So once the corporate or whoever manage the risk, right, they realize there's such bias that they have the tendency to discounting the fear in the future. So what if today, they're just gonna over practicing their risk management, like play it maybe too safe, that any chance they're gonna miss out some opportunity, or let's say in the broader way, after oil crisis, banking are become more cautious about lending. So that comes to like more private credit nowadays. Is that gonna like somehow contribute to potentially another bigger systemic risk? Like because it across like besides the bank that's less regulated.
So the question had to do with the notion of time, and that the most recent banking crisis led to a pullback in the general lending space, in the public lending space, and has led to this private credit market, and has the growth in that private credit market led to, could it lead to the next systemic crisis? And actually, I'm going to have Bob address that first, and then John and I will chime in.
Well, private credit, right? So by definition, there's very little visibility, so that you don't know unlike the banks where they have to, because of CECL, they have to report how they quantify the risks and so forth. You don't have that information there. So think of private credit as being shadow banking. And shadow banking normally has been responsible for the majority of the systemic crises that I'm aware of, going back to the previous century. And so that's a big danger for sure. Because they have connections to the regular banking, right? You have all of the big banks, every bank they have invested, they have lent money to those companies, right? So if something happens to them, if the private credits blow up, then that's going to have repercussions, right? That's where the contagion comes in. So, that's just a historical connection between shadow banking and banking, and how the two can coexist, make a lot of money in certain periods of times, but in other periods where you have stress in the system, it's a danger time. So, were you asking the question in terms of the what the subject was of today's discussion, that how could those things be mitigated from a cognitive bias point of view? Was that the?
Well, I just wanted to add a little bit on, and then maybe I can sort of give my sort of view from the cognitive bias perspective, which is I think a lot of what goes on, and this has been the history in business in general, I don't want to just pick on financial services, but since you brought up banking, we'll bring up that there has always been an attempt to regulate and create rules to manage systemic risk. And then what happens is that you have some smart people who figure out ways around it, legal ways, but ways around the existing set of rules. And then word gets out and FOMO takes place. So what we mean by FOMO, of course, is fear of missing out. No bank wants to miss out on an opportunity that they see. And there's also a certain amount of other aspects of loss aversion in that, gee, if I can write this business and write it with less capital, then I'm going to do it. So that comes into play, and there's also a certain amount of social proof and groupthink, not necessarily groupthink in a room per se, but groupthink within an industry. You have a lot of smart minds who are collecting information on the ground, people at different banks and in different industry settings, maybe things being talked about, and there tends to be a certain contagion to get in on it. We saw this happen with the 2008 financial crisis. That ultimately led to a massive amount of over-leveraging and overextending of credit. So again, we'll see how this plays out, Tracy, but it's certainly the seeds are being planted for something like that. Not that I'm making a prediction here.
Okay, this gentleman here.
Hey, hi, Ms. Lauria. You said this was your first formal textbook writing experience, and congrats, and wish you best of luck for the many more to come. My question is, were there any instances when you realized something during this writing process that challenged your prior knowledge? This also goes to you.
You want to start?
Yeah. So the question is, in the process of writing this book, were there any instances we came across that challenged our own prior knowledge in putting this together? In writing the book, I don't think so. Not so much in writing the book, but that's only in the formal process of writing the book, which has been the last 2 years or so.
3 years.
Yeah. What we need to keep in mind is that Rich and I think in our heads, we've been writing this book since 2019. We've been, I would say, in terms of putting the content together and figuring out what's the framework, we've been doing that since those earliest conversations back during office hours in 2019. And in those cases, yes, lots of challenges in terms of what we thought we knew, or I'm speaking for myself here, what I thought I knew and how this slots into, especially for me, the applied business space, because that's not the world from which I come. I'm a neuroscientist. Figuring out how this all translates into a practical applied space was a new experience for me. Very welcome one, and I think that's a big part of why it was so much fun and why we were able to tolerate dealing with all of the drudgery of writing a book, because it was just enjoyable to do. That's my answer. Rich, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that's true. That's true, John. I think most of where I went, I didn't know that. Man, that's mind-blowing. Happened during our conversations, particularly that first semester when we co-taught the course back in fall 2019. But even beyond that, just conversations we had in terms of understanding things like, what does prospect theory imply? And then relating it back to some of the experiences I had had as a corporate actuary was just, whoa, that's what was going on. That was an example of groupthink, or that was an example of loss aversion, or intertemporal discounting. All these things started to make more sense in terms of, I knew things were going on that were more behavioral than specific business, or things that could be fully explained by logic and maximizing shareholder value. But I found that I couldn't put words to it. I didn't have a framework. I didn't have a behavioral framework, but I knew it had something to do with what people were doing. And to John's earlier point about irrationality, I started just calling some of these things, this is irrational. Why would somebody do this? And I've been humbled by that to realize that whether something is rational or not really is contextual. It truly is. And that's something that I hope comes through in the book. And that's why, to another point that John made, responding to the question about how do you implement this into an ERM program, it's by nature contextual, and it's by nature you have to look at the circumstances on the ground.
Going back to the time question, right? One of the innovations, let's say, of cognitive bias or behavioral economics is that the reversal of rankings, of preferences over time. So the traditional, the expected utility model, assumes exponential discounting, meaning that the ranking of the gains over time remains the same. But the folks from the cognitive bias side, they found that people rank, let's say, a gain of $1 that you gain tomorrow versus $1 that you gain, a week later. They prefer the $1 that they get in one day, right? But in let's say if you convert this to months, if you give someone $100 or $100 or $1, let's say 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 months from now, versus $1 6 months from now, they are willing to accept the 6-month gain, because both of those gains are so much far in time that really for them it doesn't make, they discount the 6-month dollar at a much lower rate, so it has more value. But the same gain in a shorter period of time is not the same. It's the one that's closer is preferred first. So that was an innovation, right? Because when you discount a cash flow, right, you treat all of them in terms of how they rank consistently. Whereas the preferences that came out of those experiments shows that those preferences can be reversed. That's something that, to me, that was a new thing. That it didn't used to be that way.
It's true.
Hi, I'm Mrs. Stanley. So I'm a consultant by trade, and I often find myself dealing with leadership teams. And as such, I find groupthink really interesting, especially in these leadership teams. And when I layer on what you said earlier on this notion of attitudes, on behaviors, I often find myself working with teams that are essentially rationalizing poor decisions. And kind of use the analogy that someone said earlier, you can't insure a house that's on the verge of fire. This often I see that the teams themselves were the ones that kind of started the fire. And then the question for me becomes, what kinds of interventions are needed to ensure that these teams stop setting these fires? They're not essentially not learning from their mistakes. And as a consultant, I kind of have to come in and try to be like, we don't do that. But I'm wondering, are there any thoughts or frameworks, just things that you've experienced that really help people kind of break this kind of first behavior followed by rationalization of?
Yeah, so the question is, what sort of specific interventions exist to mitigate groupthink and mitigate the process of people who are setting the fires and then trying to put out the fires that they themselves have set? This is a fantastic question. This is honestly, I think the entirety, well, not the entirety, it's the back half of one of the chapters of the book. And there are a number of specific interventions. I'll just throw a few out there, and then Rich, you can fill in the gaps. One of the big ones is limiting group activities. It's obviously work by consensus is prioritized, but only put people together in a room when they absolutely need to be. Have them work independently, and in doing so, they're going to develop their own conclusions and their own defenses of their positions, and they'll be much less prone to being steamrolled by somebody else or having their own thought process shut down. Another big one is time. Limit the amount of time people have in the room. The longer they sit there in the room together, the more people tend to capitulate or line up. Bladders get full, tempers get short. Sure, fine, I'll go along, whatever. Let's just get this over with. And keep it short to the point. So have people do their own research, their own summaries, and then come with a well-defined agenda of, we're going to evaluate this, and we are breaking in 45 minutes, come hell or high water.
Yeah, I think in terms of getting people to stop putting out the fires, I think when it's put in the context of behavioral forces that are driving the behaviors that are creating the fires, it makes it less of a blame game. Because again, no one wants to be ostracized in some way. No one wants to be called out as you're the problem, or you did this. I think if it can be put in the context of, okay, here was the information that was there, and here's how that information was being processed, and here are some of the biases or behavioral drivers that led to this information being used in such a way. I think if it can be put in that context, it's less threatening. Because at our heart, again, John keeps referring to, we are wired to survive and reproduce. Okay, so from what I've learned, not only through my interactions with John, but also in the psychological space and through my work, my yoga teacher training, all that sort of thing, is that there's a lot of layers of survival. Okay, the most obvious one, of course, is I'm breathing or I'm not breathing. But we do ego creation all the time. In fact, I would argue that much of our energy is spent on constructing who we are and how we define ourselves. And anything that's even a chink in that, oh my God, what I thought about myself might not be true. Oh my Lord. So when you take someone who is a very thoughtful, very bright executive, has a certain story about him or herself, and you start to say, well, you know, you did this, you did that. I mean, it becomes threatening to that. But I think if it's put in the context of understandable behavioral drivers that are underlined by how our brain is wired, then I think it becomes a little bit less threatening. And maybe in your consulting work, that's a tack you could take to get more buy-in. We can talk about it offline. I would love to have the conversation.
All right, I think we have come to an end. The time has run out. But if you have questions that you'd like to be addressed, you can email them to Rich and John so that you get the answers.
We really appreciate all the questions and your attention and your interest in this topic, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great.